Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Bloum. We'll be focusing on a key topic discussed by educators, normalising wellbeing conversations with students. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today. We recognise their continued connection to the land and waters across Australia and pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. My name is James Holder from Bloum and Rebecca Goodhue from ARACY is our special guest today. Today's webinar is designed to empower educators by raising awareness around some of the platforms, frameworks and training made available, designed by industry experts to help us understand the various domains of wellbeing and to further improve student learning outcomes. Bloum is a powerful student growth platform that helps schools visualise the relationship between wellbeing and learning. Our holistic approach allows schools to gain greater insight across academic, attendance and wellbeing information, which helps build the foundation of a wellbeing focused conversation. In order for all of this to function correctly, Bloum comes equipped with a student self-check-in tool that helps us visualise a student's wellbeing journey. This is where we decided to engage with ARACY to adopt the wellbeing domains from their NEST and Common Approach framework, which you will learn more about today. Bloum regularly engages with educators from all levels within a school. What we have learnt is that teachers, year level leaders, your house coordinators, any educator that may not be in a wellbeing specific role can find it difficult to navigate having a general wellbeing conversation with a student. This now brings me to introduce our guest speaker for today. I'm delighted to welcome Rebecca Goodhue, otherwise known as Bex amongst our team. Rebecca has led a speech-language pathology team in rural Western Australia and has managed the development of a national strategy regarding early language and literacy. In her current role, Rebecca developed a holistic wellbeing training program at ARACY that has been adopted internationally. Rebecca is a thought leader known for her understanding of the wellbeing of children and young people. Rebecca, please take it away.
Thanks, James. It's great to be here and thank you for inviting me. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands upon which my feet are placed today, and that's the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in Canberra. We're talking about wellbeing. I'd like to start with how we define wellbeing. There is no current global definition of wellbeing, so that is problematic in the way that when people hear that word, they are interpreting that differently. In the education space, a lot of people interpret wellbeing as social-emotional learning, and sometimes in the health sector as just mental health. But wellbeing is a lot broader than that. And although we can't define it per se, we've got pretty good at describing it. So wellbeing is around thriving, not just surviving. It's a dynamic state in that it follows the natural ebbs and flows of life and the natural ups and downs. It's not about being happy all of the time. It's multifaceted or multidimensional in the way that it's not just social-emotional learning. It's not just mental health. It has lots of different aspects involved. For a young person, their well-being is much more closely linked to their family's well-being than for an adult's. Well-being is a major contributor to quality of life. It's not one and the same. Wellbeing is both subjective and objective in the way that it's both about how does that student think and feel about their life and about objectively those actual measurable conditions. And it's holistic. So what do we mean by holistic? That's where the NEST comes in, which James mentioned earlier. So the NEST is Australia's wellbeing framework for children and young people. It was developed by ARACY in 2012 with 150 partner organisations. It involved thousands of voices of children, young people, experts across all sectors, researchers, practitioners, and a lot of people who work very regularly or have expertise in various aspects around children and young people. I'm pleased to say it's not an acronym. We are talking about a NEST here, and that name was titled from a young person who was involved in the process. It took 2 years to build the nest. At the end of the 2 years, at one of the workshops, there was a discussion about the 6 areas of well-being. And this young person stood up and said, it's like if each of these 6 areas are supported, then we can be happy and healthy and fly from the nest. So what are these 6 areas? In no particular order, we're talking about material basics, which is what you'd expect in terms of stable housing, access to transport, having enough money for necessities, but also things like spending regular time in nature as part of material basics. Feeling valued by your teachers, feeling loved by your family, feeling safe or being safe at home, at school, in the neighbourhood, online. Healthy encompasses mental health, emotional health, and physical health. Having a positive sense of identity and culture, and that's important regardless of ethnicity or background, but particularly important for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders or young people from a culturally and linguistically diverse background. Learning is broader than just classroom learning here. So this is what we're talking about when we're discussing family and parent engagement in learning, learning in the community, any and all time learning. And participating encompasses having that young person having a voice in decisions that impact them, as well as being part of teams, clubs, society as a whole. And you can see there how when each of these areas of well-being was coming into the nest, that the whole structure of the nest was getting strengthened. If we don't consider and support each of these domains, then there's going to be weak points in the nest and even gaps, holes in the nest. But if each of these 6 areas are considered and supported, then we can have children, young people that are going to be happy and healthy, fly from the nest.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bex, for introducing us to the nest. So I want to, I suppose, freeze frame here and reflect on the events of the past 3 years. So, I hate to dredge up, old feelings from, some very tough times and, even mention the dreaded word of lockdowns and remote learning. But we need to acknowledge that these things happen. So during that time, we really did, I suppose, bring student wellbeing into the forefront more so than ever, because the impact of everything that happened over that period of time was quite severe. So from your perspective, reflecting on the past 3 years, how do you feel those domains in their definition may have changed and how we interpret that and how we embed it as part of our wellbeing culture now today?
Yeah, so those 6 wellbeing domains are very high level. So the 6 domains you can see on the slide now haven't changed in terms of those 6 names of those areas. However, what sits underneath them absolutely continuing to evolve and have over the last 10 years since it was initially constructed. As an example, for the pandemic and the lockdowns, we know that a lot of families lost jobs or had limited income, and so that material basics area was really impacted, and that caused a lot of stress in many of the families and households, which obviously comes into that healthy area. And for some families, that actually created a space in their house where they didn't feel safe. So you're moving into valued, loved and safe here. So you can see that there's a lot of interconnectivity between these 6 domains. They're not separate or distinct. For learning, the transition to remote learning meant that there was pros and cons. And the pros we heard from teachers is that they could see the students' environment, home environment, a lot more. They're being literally zoomed into their house. And so that was a positive in the way that they could understand more around the context and broader life of that student. It also meant that the participating was much more online, obviously, with limited ability to participate in real life. And what we heard from the education sector over the COVID period was around the more emphasis that students and young people need to have their wellbeing supported in each of the other areas for learning to be able to occur to the full potential. And we knew that obviously prior to COVID, but it really emphasized the fact that if the material basics was limited, if there's mental health issues, if the participating was not able to be in a way that provide the best fulfillment, that they're not feeling safe, well, they're not in a position to be ready and able to be learning classroom curriculum.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Bex. Provide some great context just around, the last 3 years and how we may have used a framework like this then and now. So thank you very much.
So that's the nest, and that's all well and good in terms of a wellbeing framework and useful to have as a theoretical framework. But what does that mean in real life? How do we translate that to on the ground within schools? That's when the common approach comes in. So you can see the definition on your screen here, but essentially the common approach is a way to have best practice conversations about wellbeing with students and their families. It's a way to help young people have a more consistent, a more positive, and a more empowering experience. And I want to make a point here that this is a way of working on an approach to help everyone have these wellbeing conversations. This is not just for your wellbeing student officers or your school psychologist or that person within the school context that has wellbeing officially in their remit. Because what we're doing with the common approach is essentially having a conversation about wellbeing to be able to identify issues earlier or even potential issues. We can't continue to only be having wellbeing conversations with those people within a school environment that have that official responsibility for wellbeing. Because the common approach is around having those broad and holistic conversations that whatever is emerging out of those conversations, it's not necessarily your responsibility to address or resolve what's coming out of these conversations. But it is your responsibility, if you're an adult who has regular interaction with a young person, to be having these conversations so that supports can be linked into place earlier than what is currently happening. So that in a broader long-term scheme of things, there's less young people experiencing crisis. That's the main objective of the common approach. And that's when this normalising concept comes into play. Is that it's normalizing in that it's okay to be having these conversations with whoever you have a positive and trusting relationship with. And in a school environment, that might be a front desk administrator, that could be a sporting coach, that could be anyone who that young person feels trust and the confidence to be able to open up with and have a potentially vulnerable conversation with.
I really wanted to back your point up there, Bex, with regards to the need to, I suppose, broaden the number of educators at a school that are in a position to have these kinds of wellbeing or general wellbeing conversations. When a school does implement Bloum, it's not unusual to see a 15% increase in students wanting to have a conversation about how they feel. And it's, you take into consideration a school with 1,000 odd students, 15%, 150 odd students over the course of a month, for example, saying, hey, yeah, I'm not feeling my best and I'd love to have a chat with someone I trust about it. That need becomes unserviceable very quickly. So I can see very quickly and easily how the common approach framework and that training combined with the way Bloum provides an opportunity for students to express how they feel in maybe a way that they feel more comfortable with than a direct conversation, using a platform to categorise how they feel is an appropriate strategy to help broaden that strategy.
Absolutely. And the stats back you up there, James, in that, a school of 800 people, we would expect about 200 of those students to be experiencing moderate to severe wellbeing issues. So we can't continue to expect only the school psych or, a similar position to be having these sort of conversations with that many students. And having a platform like Bloum means that students in their own time can be completing that check-in. And when they're ready, they can have a conversation. That, one day to the next, they might not be in a space where they're wanting to have that conversation, but they're being able to have that opportunity in an online, digitized format to be able to still reflect upon their wellbeing.
Absolutely. Thanks, Bex.
So I want to now just go over what the Common Approach is not. It is not a risk assessment tool of any description. It's not a tool in the way that it needs to be universal. And tools generally are something that, as an adult, you're assessing and making a judgment upon that young person or the situation, looking in your toolbox for what you deem most appropriate and pulling that tool out. The Common Approach is not that, in the way that it doesn't matter about what you're seeing or what you believe about this student or their situation. It needs to be used regardless. We know that we're not across what that is happening for that young person unless they tell us. So the Common Approach is a universal way of working. It's not diagnostic in the way that you don't you're not getting a score, you're not getting a label, it's not standardized, it's not a tick box exercise, and it's not appropriate for crisis situations for obvious reasons. If there's a crisis, then that student and family and whoever is most appropriate needs to be addressing what's going on for them. So really it is literally an ongoing conversation with that young person about their well-being. There are 4 practices that make up the Common Approach. These are not, they won't be new to you. They are not radical, revolutionary new practices. They're child-centered, which is the same concept as student-centered, patient-centered, client-centered, human-centered. We just use child-centered within the Common Approach. Strengths-based, that's around creating more opportunities for positive experiences. This is something that has come in the last 10 years or so in the research. The deep understanding about how positive experiences can mitigate and really help the adverse experiences that a lot of our young people are experiencing. And also about working out what is working well for that young person and their family, and how can that help their areas of need. Holistic refers to all aspects of well-being, and that's where the nest and the Common Approach speak to each other. So by holistic, we mean considering those 6 areas of well-being of the nest. Working in partnership refers to working not just collaboratively with that young person, that student themselves, but their family and anyone else who's involved with that young person. And you can see down the bottom there that by using these 4 practices, you are more likely to establish and maintain positive, trusting, and responsive relationships. But that is bi-directional as well. So if you have a positive and trusting relationship with that student, then you're more likely to be able to have effective and regular Common Approach conversations. And it's interesting because I've been training people for 8 years now in the Common Approach, and most people who we deliver training to understand the importance of these 4 practices. They may be in organisational guidelines and professional documents, but when it comes down to implementing all 4 consistently, a lot of people struggle. And I'm, as James mentioned, a speech and language pathologist by trade, and when I discovered the Common Approach, I'd been practicing for about 15 years, and I honestly was surprised at how the Common Approach changed my practice, because I knew about these 4 practices. I tried to use them, but until I actually did training specifically around what does that actually mean, and the resources to support me to consistently use that, I struggled to use all four in every interaction. Because if we take child-centered as an example, most people will say, yeah, I work in a child-centered way. Okay, how do you do that? Oh, well, by putting the child at the center. What does that mean? What are the phrases that you use? What is the behavior that you show? And, we really need to get to that nitty-gritty. What does child-centered really mean? Well, it means ensuring that that student has a voice in decisions that impact them, but not just gathering that voice, acting on that voice if at all possible. There is quite a distinction between listening and then acting on a child's voice or a student's voice. And another aspect of child-centered practice is ensuring that that student has the right relevant information for whatever's going on for them, for their situation, but ensuring that that information is delivered in the most appropriate way. So that probably isn't, here's a brochure. It might be, let's watch a 2-minute video together and then talk about that. So there's a lot that sits underneath these 4 practices of the Common Approach.
Bex, I just noticed there that there was a couple of obvious harmonies between Bloum and the Common Approach and the way that we are integrating the Common Approach into our platform. In particular, focusing in on the child-centered practice. When students complete their wellbeing check-in using Bloum, we're providing students an opportunity to tell someone they trust that they would like to have a conversation about that, how they feel, really owning that space, building that agency, giving them an opportunity to build on their own resilience by finding a pathway to support themselves. How do you think providing students access to a tool like this, where they can reflect on their own well-being or even initiate a conversation, helps with that child-centered practice?
Yeah, it's perfect in the way that these digitized approaches like Bloum need to be implemented in parallel with a relational approach like the Common Approach. They really complement each other. And by having the opportunity to check in via the Bloum platform means that that adult who is having that wellbeing conversation already has some of that child's voice as an initial starting point. And that's such a benefit and advantage to that foundation of that wellbeing conversation.
Yeah, perfect. And in talking about the holistic practice, and holistic's a term we love referencing at Bloum due to the nature of our platform. It's a really important focus for us, being holistic in every way. Our intention is to empower educators with additional context around how a student might be feeling or what's influencing all aspects of their wellbeing, all wellbeing domains. Our conversation might focus on a specific domain such as their engagement and learning. However, how does having that increased visibility over all domains of a student's wellbeing help form the foundation of that conversation? How will it help an adult speak and have that conversation with a young person?
Yeah, there's just more understanding there from the adult initially, because you're seeing that data and information from Bloum. You're having a better understanding of the background, of the context, the nuance of what's going on for that young person initially. And I think to emphasize the point I mentioned earlier around, we know that if we want students to be in a place where they are ready and able to learn, to maximize their learning, then we need all other aspects of wellbeing to be supported. And so we can't just be looking at a student through that learning lens only. We do need to be holistic and be understanding what those other areas of wellbeing are.
That's great. Thanks, Bex.
So within a Common Approach conversation, we also talk about the next steps. And then you can see up on the screen here that there's a spectrum of next steps. The distinction with the Common Approach and other ways of working is the emphasis on that first circle here. So the action the child or the family can take themselves. This is where that empowering concept comes into play, in that within a Common Approach conversation, we are collaboratively identifying what a next step could be for that student that uses their strengths and helps their areas of need. So this is small, realistic steps that could be implemented tomorrow that ideally the student has come up with themselves, or you've provided a little nudge and it's done in partnership with yourself and that student. Obviously, if we go down that other end of the spectrum, if you see the need for a referral to a speech and language pathologist, OT, any other specialist, then you will need to follow those processes. But generally, we do that anyway. What the emphasis is on within the common approach is down that other end around how can we build capacity of that young person and the family to understand, well, what wellbeing is as a concept, what wellbeing means for me, what's my wellbeing like right now in this moment, because we know that changes day to day, week to week. And how can I use and leverage my strengths, what's working well for me, to help areas that might not be working well currently.
Bex, we surveyed over 100 educators, so assistant principals, heads of wellbeing, so several layers within schools about how they felt with regard to teaching staff having wellbeing conversations with students, right? And I say teaching staff specifically because it's not uncommon to see students have a lot of trust with some of their teachers, right? And that might be the individual that student wants to have a conversation with. We found more than a third don't feel confident enough having those conversations. We feel that a significant contributor to this might actually be the idea that every wellbeing conversation might end up being a crisis level conversation, and that could create quite a bit of apprehension with regards to engaging with a student on that level. What advice would you have for adults, teachers, educators of any level within a school in terms of how they approach a conversation and perhaps not have that fear of everything becoming a crisis immediately?
Yeah, that is a common fear, and there's a couple of points I want to make to answer that question, James. So first of all, this is around the need for this type of approach to be common, right? We need to diversify the number of adults who are able to have these types of conversations so that the students are having their wellbeing conversations more regularly. So it's less likely that when a conversation happens, a crisis is actually being experienced, because they've been having these conversations every few days or every few weeks. So supports are in place so that the crisis hasn't been reached yet. Secondly, we know that a lot of educators have fear around well, it's not my job, that's not my responsibility. But we want to emphasize the point I made earlier around whatever emerges or is identified within these wellbeing conversations may not be and won't be, if you're a teacher as opposed to a social worker or a school psychologist, not your responsibility to address or resolve what's coming out of these conversations. Your responsibility is to reassure that student that whatever they're disclosed or sharing with you was the right thing to do, and then if it is of a serious nature, follow your organisational protocols or procedures as per you would with anything like that. Thirdly, to say that adults generally have a fear around feeling uncomfortable. There's a certain level of discomfort potentially having these conversations because you don't know what's going to be said or shared. And we need to be okay with feeling that discomfort for the benefit of our young people. If you are working and interacting regularly with a young person and have these relationships with the student, then we need to be having these wellbeing conversations regardless of what your position description says. And essentially, we need to train ourselves to feel okay with maybe having a little bit of discomfort or uncomfortable feelings starting off with these conversations, because long term, we're helping the young people with their wellbeing.
Yeah, amazing. Thanks, Bex. I really want to, I suppose, drive that point home. We've mentioned the common approach, common, normalise. It seems to really underpin the whole idea here that if it is I suppose, a part of the culture of the school, that idea that everything is surrounded by crisis will start to fade away. So makes complete sense, and that's a takeaway for me personally as well. Thanks, Bex.
So now I want to go on to the Common Approach resources. You can see on your screen the Wellbeing Wheel, and this is sort of the foundation of the Common Approach resources. You'll see that it takes an ecological developmental framework, and that the child's in the centre. Then it's the child within the family context in that middle ring, and then the child within the community level in that outer ring. And you'll recognise those 6 areas of wellbeing around the outside. In each segment of that wheel are starting points. They're prompts, they're high-level indicators, they're ideas about what could fit under each of those 6 areas of wellbeing at the child, or the child within the family, or the child within the community levels. There is a whole suite of resources that comes with the Common Approach training, and they include question booklets, which cover each of those 6 areas of wellbeing. Posters. The posters are really good to have up in waiting rooms or front, desk entrance spaces at schools. It really helps with that normalising. You're not having these Common Approach conversations because you're the naughty kid in the class, or you've got mental health issues. It's for everyone. Everyone needs to have their wellbeing considered and supported across these 6 areas. There's prompts for you as the adult, sort of reference resources to remind you. You might not be comfortable or familiar with asking about certain areas or certain domains, and so there's example questions to cover within each of those 6 areas.
Thanks for that, Bex. What advice do you have for schools that are looking to embed the Common Approach framework? What's a normal starting point in terms of, do you work at a team level, a few individuals that are quite passionate? Where do you start?
Yeah, that's different for each school. What's worked well in the past is identifying a small group of people at various levels and areas of the school to start with training. So training is involved to access these resources and to understand those 4 practices. The training is a blended learning course in the way that there's self-paced online modules that take about 3 hours to complete, and then a 90-minute online workshop after that. And what's worked well is identifying a small group of champions within that school. So that might be a person in the leadership group, a couple of teachers, a teacher aide, and a front desk administrator, for example. And they would go through the training and then look at how would they then implement that at a school level, and who is the next lot of people to then complete the training. But it had the main point to emphasize here is to identify champions within the school at various levels and area of that school context, to ensure that this is an embedded way of working. We need this to be a sustained way of working to make that real population level change and that large scale change. Because really, if we zoom out and look at what the Common Approach is trying to do, it is shifting those resources and energy and time that we are currently spending on the students experiencing crisis, and moving most of that into that early intervention prevention space.
Awesome, thank you, Bex. I might answer the same question in the context of Bloum. So if you are looking at introducing some kind of check-in tool, Bloum is really designed to complement the school's overall long-term strategy, and we help in specific areas where wellbeing is not explicitly shown as a direct link towards improving academic outcomes. We can help identify the link between those academic outcomes and improvements, and how wellbeing may be able to positively support that, or how it might be currently negatively impacting that. So The data that's shown through Bloum will help greatly with that process. What we encourage is you just talk to us and explain what you're looking to achieve. We can relate that back to how Bloum works. We can actually allow you to trial our check-in with the year level of your students and see how they respond to the check-in tool, see what kind of information and data you get, see what kind of volume of conversation requests come through, and really look at building a strategy out from there. I can see a few more questions coming through from the audience today. One around the age appropriate nature of both platforms. So from Bloom's perspective, I'll answer that one. We're designed really for your upper primary through to all secondary years. We require, I suppose, a certain level of digital literacy and maturity to understand how to reflect on your own well-being, so that the data we capture is obviously relevant, it's authentic and genuine in nature. Bex, I'll just get you to recap on the suitable age range for the Common Approach framework as well.
Sure. The Common Approach can work for young kids sort of prior to school up to 24 years of age. In terms of the resources, though, they are specifically designed for starting around 8 years and up.
That's great. Thanks, Bex.
Can I just add, James, that something I really appreciate about Bloum is that it's not just holistic in the way that it's considering those 6 areas of well-being that we've discussed. It's holistic in the way that it's providing data across different areas of the students' learning academic space, in the way you're getting data on internal assessments from the school, data from standardized assessments, and the student's voice around their well-being themselves. And I think it's a really powerful way of having these well-being conversations that previously has not been able to be had.
Thanks for that, Beck. I'd like to also, I suppose, add to that by showing off a very specific example that we see quite frequently displayed within Bloum, and it ties in quite nicely to a question I can see from our audience today around providing an example of how to start a conversation proactively, and what goes into that. So take, for example, a student that has completed a number of check-ins through Bloum, and what that reveals to us is their overall state of well-being. However, we can also see there's a specific domain of well-being that they may have reflected on and feel that it has quite a significant negative impact. If that well-being, for example, might be material basics, which is not uncommon to see today, given that the rising costs for families, school funding challenges that impact on available resourcing, all kinds of areas that can have an impact on that material basics domain. What would it look like to normalise a conversation picturing an educator that now has all that information at their disposal? The student has a reasonable level of well-being, but we can see that one area might be quite a concern for their own personal well-being space. How would you start a conversation proactively and start to normalise it?
Sure. So, important point to make first is that remembering that this is not a one-off conversation. You're not having this wellbeing conversation once a year. So, picking up from what you know of the student previously, other conversations you've had, is always a good starting point. Or how'd you go in the weekend? You had that soccer game. Whatever it is that you can pick up on that shows that ongoing relationship, and that you've been listening and that you value, what that young person is saying, is always a good starting point, as well as open-ended questions. We always want to start with, how are things going at home? And so you would probably ask that type of question if you know that material basics, for example, is the area that is showing as decreased as opposed to other areas. Another point to make is that this is a conversation, right? This is not an interview. This is not an interrogation. So we, as adults, want to think about, what are we comfortable in sharing with that student to make it a dialogue. This needs to be a two-way conversation to show mutual respect, to be natural, to be effective. So that might look like something that you want to share about your home, or your material basics aspects, and then say, what about you? Or how does that look for you? So I think having that starting point with that data is really useful in terms of what sort of topics or areas you want to start asking around within that wellbeing conversation.
Fantastic, thanks for that. I can see other questions come through asking about how Bloum is actually using the Common Approach framework and the NEST in that check-in process. So I'm going to expand on that a little bit. Students tend to complete through our platform a self-check-in at least once a week. They'll be asked 4 questions. And these are all derived from the Common Approach framework, the languages, the questions, they link back to those wellbeing domains. So the first question they're asked is about their mood, whether they are feeling, quite good or whether they're struggling in terms of how their current mood. If they would like to speak to someone about how they feel. So this is not just for themselves. They're always asked about whether they'd like to speak to someone about how they feel. This might also be for one of their peers that they might be worried about. So it's important that we're always giving them a chance to have a conversation, if not for themselves, for someone else. The final 2 questions, again, are derived from the NEST and Common Approach framework. As an example, if we look at the domain of material basics that we were just talking about, a question would be, I feel that I can access necessities like public transport and enough food and clothes. And then a student will reflect on that and give us their thoughts about whether they do feel they have that access, and then they'll be asked about what might be positively or negatively influencing their access, things like money, family, other challenges that might be within their lives. So we get that lower level data to understand more about what's impacting them, and that then starts to form a basis of that conversation, that normalised conversation that the teacher would have.
I'll add to that, James, by saying that that's also part of that building capacity concept, in the way that by being asked these questions week on regularly, then students start to understand, okay, that's part of my wellbeing and that's part of my wellbeing, and all of these aspects form my holistic wellbeing. So even just by having familiarizing themselves with what questions they're getting asked is building their understanding and their capacity around the concept of wellbeing.
Brilliant, couldn't agree more. So that's all we have time for today. I can still see more questions coming through, and all I can do is encourage you to reach out to either myself or Bex and, rattle off anything else in terms of questions around wellbeing, conversations. We're here to help. Thank you, Bex, for your time today. Really appreciate everything that you've been able to contribute. It was fantastic having that conversation around normalising wellbeing. Obviously, heaps more that we can cover off, plenty to discuss. I do want to encourage everyone with any further questions to reach out to either myself or Bex in the next email that will circulate out in terms of further follow-up. If you'd like to experience the Common Approach, experience Bloum, please let us know. We're happy to support you. I would also like to invite everyone to our next webinar, where we're going to be focusing on viewing students' growth holistically. We'll have Lynn O'Grady, author, psychologist, as our keynote speaker for that event, so please stay tuned for communications around that. Thank you again, Rebecca. Really, really appreciate your time today, and thank you to everyone who's joined us.